There are, I think, a range of different ways that you can decarbonize benchmarks in the same way that you can look at an active portfolio and increase or decrease exposure towards certain climate or ESG type parameters. And we've seen a real shift from decarbonization, meaning simply taking out the heaviest emitters. And I think it was Maxime that put this very well. It's not simply a case that you're going to take out the obvious and most highly exposed companies in particular sectors, and then that doesn't automatically lend itself to climate solution. I think particularly when we're looking at working with large institutional global asset owners, there's, I think, a drive towards wanting to retain ownership and exposure to companies in industries that need to transition, not least from the stewardship perspective, because in order to have influence over how companies decarbonize and effectively to hold them to account in many respects, to ensure that they are sticking to the plans that they're putting out, having an element of ownership becomes very important. So that's one thing I would say. It's not simply about divestment, but in terms of how you then build or construct a benchmark, there are multiple different ways that you can do that. I mean, you've just mentioned, I think, having targets, which is becoming very important, not least because of the EU climate benchmark regulations, which are built around a system or a series of specific targets in terms of reduction in operational carbon emissions and intensity. But you can also, without having a specific target, you can also simply tilt away from the most highly exposed stocks within a benchmark universe. But here again, there is something of a balancing act in terms of keeping your overall industry exposure as well, so that you're not simply tilting towards companies that are not in sectors that are exposed to fossil fuel activities. But I do think that the Paris-aligned benchmark, the climate transition benchmark that we've seen come out of Europe, have been very interesting, not only to investors in that part of the world, but also here. So, for example, we launched a series of partnership indexes with JPX earlier this year based on the EU climate benchmark regulation. And we found that investors, even in Japan, were very keen to maintain that level of designation around what it means to create a Paris-aligned benchmark and to have that specific decarbonization trajectory, initially with a sort of a drop of 30 or 50% in operational emissions intensity, and then to have the 7%, or it could be a 10% year-on-year decarbonization versus a Paris benchmark. So I think there's firstly that element of having a line of the sand in terms of what a climate benchmark should look like. But then I think there's also a level of comfort, perhaps, in knowing what the outcome of your benchmark is going to be, even though having a set reduction or a targeted reduction doesn't necessarily mean that you're decarbonizing more significantly than a tilt. I mean, you can wind up really in a very similar place. But the other thing I would say is that when we're building benchmarks, we have a number of different data sets at our disposal, in particular that piece on forward-looking considerations over what companies are doing. And here I think you need both a qualitative assessment, and we work very closely with something called the Transitions Pathway Initiative, which really seeks to understand how companies are implementing the guidelines and recommendations that have been set out by TCFD, which I think Maxime also mentioned earlier. So that's very much a qualitative approach, but forward-looking in as much as that you're understanding what companies are doing or what steps they're taking into their business strategy and their governance around climate. But you also then need to offset that by understanding how that actually plays out in terms of quantitative reduction in carbon emissions. And in the forward-looking element, what pathway they're on from a temporal perspective as well. So a lot of different things that can really come into these benchmarks.